Okay, we are recording. So I am here with Manuel Post and Mark Lefebvre. Did I say that right? Okay. So Mark, take it away.
Sure. So, I had heard your talk with Dr. John Vervaeke about the parabolic way of knowing. And I sort of, you had this argument against what you were saying. And I sort of was like, oh, that's strange. And then we were working on the four types of knowing independently, and sort of the approach we're using in this reverse engineering approach, right? So we're looking at the problems and going, well, someone like me who isn't in a meaning crisis, isn't particularly religious, but doesn't have those issues. So what did I do to make sure that I didn't fall into this very, large hole, right, to some extent? And so I had some ideas, right, but before I never even had the language, right? And then John's given us this wonderful language and this sort of science around meaning and how to understand it. And so as we were thinking about this and working on it and working away at it, and then John was talking more about the four types of knowing, and he was saying, well, you know, perspectival's wrapped up in everything, and we were sort of thinking, yeah, but what are we missing? What connections are we making in the world that aren't expressed, and why aren't they expressed? And then when we started to look at the model, and there's a lot of folks like Struan who have this idea that it's left versus right hemisphere, and it's particle versus wave. And I was thinking of it in terms of signaling, right? So you have a signal on one side, you have a signal on the other side, and there's sampling types of signals, discrete signaling and continuous signaling, and that's roughly particle and wave. And I was like, well, that's weird, because that kind of fits with Struan's work and some of this other stuff that people have talked about in the space. And then I thought, well, what's missing, from the system overall? And I came across this idea that, really you've got the propositional and the procedural, and you kind of need them both to do anything, right? Like propositions by themselves don't really get you very far, but propositions with procedures, you can do a lot with that. That's kind of, science-y, right? And then I thought, my conception of procedural is basically logic, rationality, and reason. Those are the three things, those are the three core elements behind that way of knowing from my perspective. And that really just tells you how to build paths through a bunch of propositions. And I was like, well, that's a navigational tool, right? So you've got something that kind of sets the movement or the stage, and then you've got something that sets how to go through it. But you really don't have that on the other side, right? You've got the participatory, which tells you how to move in the world, but not, it doesn't give you a goal or a way to know this is a good movement and that's a bad movement. Those are kind of like navigational tools. So we came up with, this took us weeks, by the way. This is a lot of work from a lot of people, but we came up with the concept that, it's not stories, but pieces of stories, not even parables, but pieces of parables that sort of enable you to participate in a meaningful way, right? That's and that because something's giving you feedback, that a positive feedback system that says, oh, this is the right type of participation for you to have with the world, right? So it's the right type of connection in some sense between maybe,
Connection.
yeah, where you are and where you're going. And then you form that connection from these little parable pieces. But they sort of, they act like little wormholes, right? Like they bring you from here, and then there's a decision point, and you can go this way or that way or that way. Unlike, say, something like procedural, where if you start at the same point, you have the same propositions, you're going to end at the same place every time. In the parabolic, we were thinking, no, you're not going to end up at the same place. You're going to have a bunch of choices. And those choices are going to be discernible because you have a limited number of decisions that you can understand. So it's not an infinite number of decisions. So, and it doesn't really matter necessarily where you start from, because you might have more than one starting point. You'll have like a nexus point inside the group of parable fragments that you choose, and then you can go either way. And the way we arrived at that specifically was we were looking at tarot, the tarot cards one night, and we're like, oh, what the hell, it's I'm tired, it's late at night, let's all look at the tarot cards. And then we're sitting there doing a tarot thing, and Like, wait a minute, all of these things are like pieces that you can use to build a narrative from.
Right,
And what,
right.
right. So what you're doing in tarot is you're putting down these cards in a pattern, and then you're using the relationship of the pattern to string together pieces of parables, like baby narratives, right? Or pieces of
Right.
narratives. And then you're building a story out of that that relates to a person's life, whether it's your own life or if you're doing a reading for somebody else, it's their life. And so in many ways, that's kind of, to me, the opposite. We were just discussing this earlier today. That's kind of the opposite of what a worldview from something like the Bible gives you, because there the stories are set and you relate those existing stories to your life, right? In tarot, your life is set and you're relating the pieces and building the narrative up instead of having it imposed on you.
Okay. So so you came at this from a very different way than I came at it.
Yeah.
I came at it by, I was paying a lot of attention to John's Four Ways of Knowing. And then I found I felt that I found a hole in it. Okay. Reminds me of the little song, you know, the little children's song about there's a hole in the bucket.
Mm.
Yeah, but we got to be careful that we don't go all the way around the whole song and then end up back at the hole, right? Which is what
Yeah.
happens in that little song. So so I thought that I found a hole because, and I thought, okay, having raised some children and seeing how children are navigating in the world and in relationships and how they're discovering them and how that they're taking and they're imposing the relationships on things, like I said to him with the family relationships and the silverware, and also with my little girls when they said that all dogs are boys and all cats are girls, you know, that stuff. And so I thought, if I think that I was not talking, I think when John and I were having the conversation, he kind of couldn't get kind of past those statements, because I didn't want to focus on the statements. I wanted to know, they already know something. They're knowing something already. And then what they're knowing is coming out in them saying this, or in them, you know, in the child taking silverware and pretending it's a family. The child already knows something. And I couldn't see in his scheme of the Four Ways of Knowing what it was that the child knew. And then he basically said that it was propositions. But that, I didn't find that to be completely satisfying, that it was, that what they were expressing was a propositional knowledge. Although I can acknowledge that you can have propositional knowledge before you're able to express it. You know, I think that's true. But that didn't seem to be what the child has. To me, it was, the reason I called it parabolic is that it seems like the child is seeing a pattern of relationships here and then imposing that structure of the relationships there. Okay, I'm very interested in the deep continuity stuff though, because and I don't know if you saw my video about the different levels of movement or of responses to the environment that I did.
No, I don't think I caught that one.
That was the first one. I think that was the first one that I actually did in response to John's stuff. But I talked about, you know, that the first initial organism's movement is this basic response to comfort or discomfort, you know, moving according to that. And then I went up different levels of responses that organisms have, and I ended up at, you know, awe and horror and that. So I kind of building a structural ladder with positive and negative on either side at different levels. And John really liked that video. So I'm very impressed by the deep continuity stuff, and I kind of say, I believe that there's a deep continuity. Now, I come at that from a Christian standpoint, so let me just say how I see the deep continuity. E.F. Schumacher is a Catholic philosopher and distributist, distributist economist too. He wrote a book called Economics as if People Mattered, and he also wrote something called The Guide for the Perplexed. But he just talked about the great chain of being, and he talked about did you see John's conversation with Jordan Hall that involved the great chain of being?
I saw part of it, yeah.
Okay, so they talked about the fact that as you move up, you don't lose the structures underneath, right?
Right.
Okay, but Schumacher said that it goes beyond that. It's not just that you don't lose the structures underneath, but that at each level, the upper level is actually drawing. It's not just emergent. It's also that the lower level is being drawn up. So that, for example, microbial life is actually bringing minerals into its own life. All right. And then if you understand how plants operate, because we used to think that plants' roots were just straws that they sent down into the soil and sucked up nutrients. And we now know that's not true at all. The plants send exudates into the soil, and they call the soil life to them to feed them. So they draw the soil life into their life. And then, of course, animals draw that plant life up into their life. And then human beings, we work through the whole chain, drawing it up into our life. And what Schumacher said is that it is though the entire structure of being is like an arrow pointing up, leaving us with the question, is there someone above us who is drawing us into his life? So
interesting. Yeah.
So that's why the deep continuity stuff really resonates with me a lot, that John is talking about. Well, if that's true, then what would you say, then the relevance realization has to be going all the way down. I'm not going to do like J.P. Marceau and put it into the pencil, but it's got to be going all the way down. What's relevant to a paramecium, right? I mean, a paramecium has to find some things relevant and other things not.
Right.
So anyway, that's kind of where I started thinking about it, wanting to make the connection all the way down.
Yeah, I think that has to do with life, right? Like if you're living, you need stuff. So you're automatically gonna draw things into you. That's part of being alive.
Right. But you have to know what things to draw. You're not just, living things are not just randomly drawing things into them. They're drawing certain things, right? And that gets to your whole decision tree thing.
Right.
Well, yeah, it depends who's making the decision, right? You can have evolution make the decision, right? But yeah.
Well, but in the kind of like at the very moment, it's like, I don't know if I would say evolution makes the decision. I'd say evolution favors
it sets the frame,
decisions
maybe,
over
right?
others, right?
Yeah, evolution sets the frame, right? Like it's the rules of the game, right? And then within the rules, the organism fulfills its function, right? So yes, right? Like the organism has to do work within the rules that it has to operate.
Right.
Right. And then it needs to make those connections, right?
Connections,
those connections
right.
are important. And it's the connections. So in some ways, I suspect, although I don't know, obviously, I suspect that the difference is that the connections in the parabolic way of knowing are to some extent invariant, right? So when you change frames, when you change perspectives, that rule of connection still works.
Can you give me
right?
an example?
So I mean, this is the best example of are something like the parables in the Bible, right? Because they're applicable, to a bunch of different situations, right? And there's two reasons for that, right? One is usually there's more than one thing that you can see coming from the result of the first step that you take or something, right? Like you usually have options along the path, right? Or things that are explained in the story that you can go, oh, well, I know where that might go, so maybe I'll avoid that, right? And that reduces again, this is all about combinatorial explosion, right? That would reduce your combinatorial explosion. But as you go through life, the same parables seem to have a different meaning to you or a different utility, right? Even though nothing's changed in the parable, but you have changed, right? Your situation has changed. So when you think about things like children's fairy tales, for example, all of those rules in children's fairy tales, even though they're for children, are still true, right? They're still applicable when you're an adult, right? It just, for children, the woods are a scary place and they should be careful because they could get eaten, right? Especially
Right.
back in the day when those, right? And then as you're an adult, that's
Little
less.
girls should not go walking by themselves with red hoods in the woods.
Right. Well, and the red's in there, right? Which is
Right.
right? There's all these little things that hide in there, right? That are symbols of other problems. But that's what I
Trusting
mean. Like,
strangers.
right.
Really important.
There's all of these little messages in there, and it's not that when you're adults, when you become an adult, it's okay to go in the woods, right? It's just that now you know what to watch out for. Well, you have to watch out for wolves. Well, how do you know you have to watch out for wolves? Well, because it's in the story, right? So, and that people can fool you, right? That's in the story, right? All these things are in these stories, and the way they get interpreted through time is a little bit different, but the pattern is still there. Right. It may get safer for you to go in the woods when you get older, but it's still not as safe as staying at home. Like, it doesn't matter how old you are. Going outside is dangerous. It's more
Right,
dangerous
exactly.
when you're alone and you're a child.
And now he just made the distinction, right? Oh, the woods is outside instead of just the woods, right? And then we're making more and more associated connections for the same story, and that's because we can see the analogy between things.
Right.
And
But here's one thing that I think that you guys did with the word parabolic is that you immediately related parabolic to parables, which it does relate. But I had a more, I think, expansive idea of the word parabolic, which just had to do with this idea of throwing together. So parabolic would include metaphor, it would include analogy, it would include what you're saying, the application of stories. But it would also include, like I said in my video, the lion cub watching the mother kill an animal and then imitating.
Right.
Because that is also parabolic. The lion cub has to throw together its own actions and its own, something that it's going to hunt with what it saw its mother doing. It's imitating. I mean, lions learn, cats learn from adult cats, kittens learn from adult cats how to hunt. Once you get up to, I think, like the level of birds, now you've got animals that are learning from other animals.
Right.
Right?
Yeah,
So the learning has to involve some kind of parabolic knowledge. So this is going way down through the animal kingdom, and it can't be just on the level of narrative stories that humans tell. It's got to go lower and deeper than that. And that's why I went into the idea of the prepositions being at the bottom, the prepositions being that, and that gets into your point about the orientation or the navigation and the connections, right? And I don't know, John said he wants to talk to me about this. I'm sure he's got all kinds of great objections to what I'm saying, but can you see the connection between prepositions and analogies? Did you get that from
Yeah.
what I said in my video?
Yeah, I saw your prepositions video and I wasn't as convinced by that, only because that seemed like where John would have had a reasonable argument to say, the reason why you think that is because of the constraints of language. So I think that might be correct. Maybe not,
Well,
but
let
then,
me ask you this then.
mhm.
Let me ask you this then. Okay. So let's go back. Let's go beyond past something that has language. Let's talk about that lion cub. Okay. That lion cub has to imitate these actions of the mother. Now, if we're to describe them, we're going to describe them with language. We're going to say, leap up on this animal, you know, tear its throat out, knock it down, you know, that kind of stuff. Now, the lion cub could never express that in language. Of course, we're expressing it in language, but that's not a limitation of the language, because the language comes out of these operations, these physical operations.
Right.
We have a whole set of words to describe relationships.
Right.
And they're not propositions, they're prepositions.
Right. So, but I wonder if what you're sort of catching on to is.
Just one second,
and,
let me, I gotta
sure.
close something out here. Okay, all right, we're good.
Yeah, so I wonder if what you're catching on to is sort of, and in some ways I regret using parabolic, right? Because it's being seen as parables, and it's like, we were symbols, metaphors, and parable fragments. That's what we think it is, or something like that, right? So, and maybe you can throw analogy in there. But I think that's what you're catching on to, is that maybe those things are prepositions. Those are the things that belong in the parabolic or something, right? Or that's the closest language expression to the pieces that are available in that way of knowing, that get put together in the patterns, that then the patterns get put together into larger and larger structures up the stack, so to speak.
Right, and it may be, and I think this is what John is going to say. It may be that what we're talking about is the machinery of relevance realization. It may be.
Yeah, I think.
But I
yeah.
don't know. I don't know, because he hasn't described it in this way. Because the argument I made to him was that it collapses the combinatorially explosive nature of the differences, right? So like the little child with the silverware who calls the knife daddy and the fork mommy and the spoon baby. And I said, you know, there's a combinatorially explosive number of ways that the silverware is unlike and also like the family. But she looks at it and instantly collapses it, right?
Right.
But so what is it? And see, what is it? It's the relationship. So when she puts them together and looks at them, she's looking at their relationship with one another. And she's making a connection to the relationship of her family members to one another. But again, those relationships can all be described in terms of prepositions, right? Like the daddy with the mommy, with the baby, you know.
Oh yeah, that would be our first understanding of them, right? Because that would be the way we articulate them, and that's the way we think of knowing things, like that we can articulate them. So,
yeah, but I think even before you articulate, a baby knows it's with its mommy before it can say, I'm with my mommy.
Yes, I agree, right? So I think the thing that was missing in your stories is we need to affirm the connection, right? We can make many symbolic connections between things, right? Like Viveki talks about this, when you sit in your room and you just let your awareness spread, you start seeing all of these connections in the room that you never thought would be there, right? Like it's potential, right? But then we have to choose, like, okay, I'm gonna pay attention to this connection, and then this connection is real for me for some reason, right? So you need to affirm it, right? You need to say, yes, this is one, and then you start making it stronger, right? And then when we say, right, with the circle and the square, the example is like, so apparently humans naturally gravitate to making that association and finding it meaningful, right? So the meaningfulness is a necessary component to making that structure. And yeah, and when you start doing that, then you can see how that those two things together like collapse the relevance realization, and yeah. And then when you ritualistically keep making that association, right? Every time you look at mom and dad during the dinner, you look at your spoon and you're doing the game, right? And then you grow and grow the associations, and maybe you start using it on other families as well. Like, oh, look, it works there as well, right? And then you start building this system of associations, and that doesn't have to be in language, right? Like it can be free language. Like, so yeah,
Right.
you're completely right there.
Yeah, and that I think is the key, though, right? Is that what we're really talking about when we're talking about these prepositions like baby with mommy, is we're talking about this pattern that exists, right? This
Right.
connection, right? And then John sometimes has collapsed religio to connection, right? But this is where the connection is between these things, and then that connection gets moved, right? Because it's invariant in some sense, and then that is sort of what we're talking about, is that you're making these associations. Some of them come through mimicry and observation, and some of them come maybe innate. We don't know, right? I mean, John's opened the door for that, so if the door's open, I'll take it. If we have some types of knowing that are sort of innate that we start out with or bootstrap with or something would be the computer term, right? Then fair enough. Like maybe we have some basic structures already built in, and then the minute we get language, we can express them, and how we express them is prepositions. But it's really just an expression of the pieces inside the parabolic, right? Which is the connection-based navigation system for participation in the world. That's
Okay,
how
see,
I've
I
described it.
like that. I like the idea of connection. So, like like if John has this thing where, he says like the propositional is knowing that, the procedural is knowing how. So what kind of knowing would we say the parabolic is? We would say it's knowing by connection, right?
Yeah, something like that. Right. It's understanding the relation. It's knowing by relationship.
Knowing by relationship, or knowing.
Right. But
knowing
you're not knowing by relationship. You're knowing a relationship, and then you're applying it all over the place.
Okay.
So it's sort of inverted in some sense, right? You're not knowing only by the relationship. You're knowing the relationship, and the relationship applies in multiple circumstances. And then so you're taking that and trying to apply it all over the place. And so you can imagine that that for a child, the relationship in the family unit is so basic that it's always going to put that pattern on everything else, because that pattern is there in its
Right.
life in the beginning. It's so strong, right? And then it can't imagine, like when a child first comes to and meets their first friend whose parents are divorced, right? They're just perplexed by this. Absolutely, like what? Like I don't understand, right? If
Right.
they don't have divorced parents, they literally don't understand what that means, right? Because how
Right.
can they? They've got this pattern and it's stable for them. So, and I've seen that before because my parents are divorced. So, like I would tell people, "Oh, my parents are divorced," and they're like, "Well, what the heck is that?"
Yeah.
So, yeah, some people don't know because that pattern is there, but the pattern's what they understand, and then they're just applying the pattern all over the place, right? And it's interesting too, because like you see like an old Volkswagen Beetle, and you're like, "That's a girl car." It's like, wait a minute, why, like there's all these little things that we do these assignments on, and they're absurd, right, in some sense. But it's like, well, why are we doing those assignments? That's very, very strange. And that I think is core to this whole idea of parabolic, is that it's these relationship assignments that we're making, that we're trying to apply, and sometimes incorrectly, because that's what we do with knowledge. We apply it incorrectly until we get the right application. And it's the right application that is the relevance realization. right? That's when everything sort of stacks up for you. But the advantage you get from baby patterns or pattern fragments or something is that you know that from wherever you're starting, and maybe they have multiple entry points and multiple exit points, but you know that once you're in them, you have to stay there for some time, right?
Explain that part to me.
So, for example, if you're if you're if you're if you're trying to work out how to behave around another family, right? So that you go to somebody else's house, they have a family, right? There's certain patterns that families follow. One of them would be, I don't know if you saw the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding.
Um, I've seen pieces of it.
Yeah, it's a
I know
delightful
basically what it's about. Yeah.
it's a delightful movie, but basically it's a bunch of stereotypes about a tight Greek family. And it's very funny because I know a bunch of, I'm part Greek myself, but I know a bunch of people with families like that, having grown up around Boston, where we had the Irish neighborhoods and the Italian neighborhoods and the Greek neighborhood, like we had all that.
Right.
And then the Irish people would say the same thing. Oh, my family's just like that. The pieces were different, but the pattern was exactly the same. Large family, right? They have the kooky uncle type, right? The father was always kind of weird, right? The Windex and all those strange things. And yeah, and so you see that pattern replicated. But when you're going into a new family, suppose you're from a small family like I was, and you go into one of these homes with like all the generations and stuff, and you're kind of not used to that because you grew up kind of like mommy, daddy, and me sort of thing, then how do you know how to relate to that, right? Because you don't have all those extra connections. Like, how do you relate to somebody else's uncle, for example? It's not clear to me. You can't treat them as a friend. They're not a friend, right? You can't treat them with the respect that, say, you treat the parents with, right? Because it's a little bit less because it's the parents that are that have the most
Right.
immediate connection to you, right? So like you don't know how to navigate that situation because the pattern's unfamiliar to you, right? So until you get the feel for the pattern, right? And then of course, your friend is like, oh, that's just my crazy Uncle Joe. Don't mind him. He says crazy things all the time, right? And you're
Right.
like, oh, what's that all about? Like, why is he here, right? Why is he part of this unit? We don't have a unit like that where I live, right? So yeah, it's hard to get a sense for that pattern. But then once you have that pattern, you can see it in other places because it's recurrent. Like all the Italians that I knew were like, my big fat Greek wedding, that's my family. Only different stuff, right? Different stuff. Not the Greek
Right.
stuff, the Italian stuff, right? But the pattern was the same. And it's really all large families pretty much that, people that grow up with 3 generations or whatever in the same house. They all seem to follow that, or even just a tight knit family. So I had some family members who they moved out, right? But they're a big family when they went over there, French Canadians, right? So they all had a billion kids. So it was just a huge family, and they'd all get together, and it'd be an enormous party, right? And then there'd be little factions infighting and all this weird stuff as big families have, right? So, but understanding that pattern, like for me, it was very hard because my family was like, oh, we got to get away from these crazy Catholic church, right? They were traumatized by the church, like so many people were, and they had Catholic school upbringing and the whole 9 yards. And now they're like, we got to stay away from this. But then when they go to interact in these large families, they actually had the navigation skills, and I didn't because I wasn't interacting with the family regularly enough, at least not with the extended family. So when I went over people's houses who had extended families, I didn't quite know what to make of it. I was like, what are all these weird patterns? Like, why are there more people here than like you, me, and your parents? Like that alone is
Right.
like, yeah, what is going on with this? So that's the sort of patterning that is a type of knowledge that you can use to apply in the world and participate in it. How do you participate with a family? Oh, well, there's a pattern to it, right? Here's how you participate with the male who's running the household. Here's how you participate with the mother who does all the actual work, right? And then, here's how you participate with the children. Here's what you do with a baby. Those are all like we all know what to do with a baby. Baby comes on and smiles. You smile back, right? Like that's but I personally don't smile at anybody because I don't, I'm all maladjusted to the world. But I always smiled at babies. Always smiled at kids. Adults, not so much. So it's weird, right? It's kind of ingrown, right, or ingrained to us, right? This whole idea of smiling at babies. Jordan Peterson talked about that a few times, right? And so where does all that come from? Those are relationships, right, or pieces of structure that you know to apply and that you have an appropriate application for. And then you can sort of, I don't know, to use John's terminology, exapt them, right? Well, smiling, when else do you smile? Not when babies, but during jokes, right? So you have all these, you can reconnect that pattern in other appropriate places and just keep applying it, right?
Okay, so how do you think then that, so when John was talking to you guys on the Discord Q&A, he was talking about that he might not have thoroughly explicated how all of the different ways of knowing were connected.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to be very clear that their relationship was not one of like dependence, you know, but that they reinforce one another, they work together, things like that. And
Well,
so
I actually think he wanted to make the claim that they were dependent ontologically.
that they were what?
They were ontologically dependent.
Yeah, that was his.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that they were dependent. They were dependent on each other. But
Right.
that they're interacting with each other all the time. That
Yes.
that you can't you don't have one without the others, really. Okay.
Right.
So where would you put the parabolic into the structure of all of them? Like, let's go back to your thing about the family. Okay, so you think about walking into a new structure like this and having to figure out how to relate to all of the different people, right?
Right.
Well, okay, so I think it would be parabolic in the sense that to some extent you're going to be imitating, right? You're going to be imitating your friend. That's going to show you how to behave, so you're going to imitate. That's parabolic because you're imitating. Right.
You're looking for the patterns in others that you can reproduce yourself to get the right participation, right? So I don't know why that would be controversial, right? We definitely, when you're imitating a pattern or some kind of structure that you can then reuse, and maybe it gets exapted, right? It probably should, right? But part of the thing that informed us as to the changes that we thought we would need to do the magic that we're about to do, hopefully, if we're very, very lucky and fortune smiles upon us, right? Because we're wading in waters that are impossibly deep in some sense, right? But what we had to do was move the perspectival to something more primal, in a sense, because John had already mentioned that the perspectival is very wrapped up in these other types of knowing, and so we want to put the perspectival as something more basic than a way of knowing, right? And that's sort of part of our changes.
Okay, so the perspectival is the here nowness, right? Here now, the sense of being here now, and from the here, I can look to the there, because he says the perspectival is involved with the aspirational, right? So from the here, I can look to the there. From the now, I can look to the then. But to me, the difference between that and the parabolic would be that the parabolic is not my here now, but then I look over there and I see that there and that other there, and I see how they are connected. Does that make sense what I just said?
Yeah, I think that's deeply true, right? So our thing about the perspectival is that you can't boil it down to here and now. I don't think that's even possible, because you need to be able to adopt other people's perspectives. That's not a here and now thing, right? That's a there thing. And then you need to project into the future. That's not a now thing, that's a future thing, right? And then one of the things you can do in psychotherapy or some type of, I think it's psychotherapy, whatever, I don't like psychiatry and I hate that whole field. So I'm not good with the language, but basically one of the things they do is they go back and change your perception of your own past, right? Peterson talks about this a bit, right? You can change how you related to a past event. So you're not changing the facts of the past event. You're
Right.
changing
I
your
understand.
relationship to them. And how do you do that? Well, you project your perspective back in the past and you change the parabolic relationship, right? And then that fixes something going forward because you have better relevance realization or something like that from the past event. And now it's properly connected by the parabolic into your present state. And that reduces your anxiety or your trauma or whatever. And I think that that works, like that deeply works, that you're fixing the parabolic connections in the past. But in order to do that, you need something more fundamental. And one of the arguments I've made that I'm sort of deeply wedded to so far is that without a perspective, a frame, there is no knowledge. It's just information, right? Like the information can't have any import. It can't become knowledge until it's put
buzzing.
inside a frame.
Buzzing.
Well, it's just stuff that's there,
Yeah.
but you can't make a relationship without a frame. And so what that implies to me, and John solves this another way, I think, but what it implies to me is that perspective is more basic than the 4 ways of knowing. So I'm keeping 4 because 4 is good. We like 4. We like this weird symmetry between left and right hemisphere. And I like how I can connect this, and Struan's connected something similar, right? With wave and particle, I use continuous and discrete because I think of these things as signals, right? With a volume and a frequency, right? And this is going to allow me to do a bunch of things, I think. Again, I hope, if I'm lucky, right?
Let me ask you a question about the signal stuff. Do you
Sure.
know about stochastic resonance?
Yes. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I'm not an expert on any of that, but yeah, I do understand the concept. Yes.
So how would that fit in here somehow?
Potentially, right. Well, part of the whole idea of making things signals in this fashion with our nice, hopefully strict, although I don't know if that's strict enough, definition around volume and frequency is that you can do neat things. Like one of the observations I made, a billion years ago was we have all these psychological conditions that, are clear end states and are very similar or the same end state, right? Like schizophrenia. But they're not arrived at the same way in people, right? Which is a weird thing if you think about it, right? So if you go back to what I was saying about procedural, that means that the brokenness can't be on that side because logically, right, you're going to get to that endpoint from the same start point as well as the start point to the end point. It's just one path, and you can't, the only way you can change the path is by changing either the start or the end point. But you've got a bunch of endpoints that end in the same place. And sure, you can hand wave away and say, yeah, but that's certainly possible under your conception. And fair enough, like maybe, but it's a lot more plausible to believe that there are these patterns that people get stuck in, right? And then it doesn't, the corruptions happen at different places, but the locus of how it ends up manifesting in the world is by corrupting the signal. So you can imagine that if you had too high a signal, say on one side of your brain, that you were too focused on propositions and procedures. And what that might do to you is make the world knowable. Not that you know the whole thing, but that you could. And once you can know the whole thing, and if you further believe that, well, if I can know the whole thing, and I have all these powerful scientific tools, for example, then I can manipulate the world any way I want, right? And so now you're looking at egoism and, a real problem around a lack of humility, right? You don't have a higher frame to sort of put yourself in, right? Or subsume into or surrender to or something like that. Submit.
Go ahead, Manuel. What were you going to say?
Oh, no, it's fine. I'll go.
I was going to ask, what would be a higher frame?
Well, the higher frame would be, what we've been calling it on the Discord server is the ineffable, right? Just to avoid using the G word. But I thought, that's close enough to the G word.
Right,
right?
Or potential or chaos, right? Like the future, basically,
Right.
like things that you don't have any control over, right? You need to have a relationship with that you cannot do by force.
Right.
That's where the submittance comes in, right? Like you don't know what the effect of your actions is going to be, and you're going to have to take the leap of faith for
Are you
whatever.
familiar with that distinction between the spirit of geometry and the spirit of finesse?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that
So yeah, that would map onto
Right.
onto the propositional versus the parabolic. There we
Yeah.
go.
okay.
Right.
So I one of the concerns I had was that, or one of the things that didn't line up for me was John seems to want to put narrative. To me, he puts narrative with propositional.
Well, he puts all of that, I think, above everything, and says, here's how you create stories. You take propositions and and you can do that. Like this is sort of part of the frustration is, well, yeah, you can, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that's fine. Or maybe there's a more efficient model with fewer moving parts or something, right? And that's sort of, where we're at, because we're sort of coming at this from the attitude of, well, if you're over boosted on one side of the brain with your propositions and your procedures, and you have a knowable world, what's the implication of that? And to me, the implication is, because the world is knowable, there's no point in participating. Like, what?
Well,
If I know everything
question.
I need to know, why waste my time?
I have a question. Okay, so when you're talking about procedural, what I'm hearing you, the way that I'm hearing you use procedural is that you're using procedural as a series of mental steps.
Well, just steps.
Steps.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether they're mental or physical, right? Like.
Right.
It's just.
Okay, so any series of steps would be procedural.
Well, it's bigger than that, right? It's logic, rationality, and reason. Those are the three things that I think are sitting in the procedural space. And then you use that with propositions, and then you build a world inside a frame, inside a perspective, right? And then if that perspective, like I said, I think that it's, when you have a starting point in something like that, you're always going to end at the same place. No matter how many times you recreate that world, that path is going to be the same, because the tools don't change, right?
Okay, let me ask you, let me lay out a particular situation or series of things and tell me how those things all sort of would map onto each other. So let me use like scuba diving as an example, because I have never been scuba diving, okay? But I have a lot of, I have certain propositional knowledge about scuba diving, right? Like I know that scuba stands for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. I know that scuba divers have to watch how long they're in the water and how deep they go, and they can't come up too fast because they'll get the bends, and that's nitrogen bubbles in the blood. And I know, and I've seen Jacques Cousteau, and when I was a kid, there was this show on called Sea Hunt with Lloyd Bridges underneath the water, and I know that they use these fins to navigate themselves around the water. So I know I have all this propositional knowledge about scuba diving, right? But I don't have any. I don't really have any. Like, I don't have any participatory knowing because I have never done it. Okay. And I probably would say that I don't have procedural knowledge of it, because I can think propositionally about what certain procedures might be, but I'm real and clear on them. I mean, you certainly should not have me go scuba diving right now, so that sort of thing, and then and then in terms of what he calls participatory knowing about scuba diving. I don't have any of that knowledge.
Right.
Okay, so would it be that okay, and then I cannot take the perspective of someone who has been scuba diving already. I have the only perspective I have is the perspective of someone whose only knowledge of scuba diving is this very rudimentary thing of having seen it, on television.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, it's kind of a weak form of understanding or something.
Right.
Yeah,
Very,
right.
very weak.
But that would be analogous as to like a feigned memory, right? Like I don't see a specific distinction between something that's actually happened and you can, or something that could happen. Like I don't see a
But
real
if I were,
distinction between
but
those.
if I were to attempt to learn scuba diving,
Mm-hmm.
I would have to do it not only through propositions, like reading a book about it or reading Scuba World magazine or something. I would have to actually imitate someone doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that would be the parabolic. And the parabolic then would lead me to having the participatory knowledge.
Right.
Does that
Yes.
make
Right.
sense?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, but
And
even
then I would have a different perspective, because then I would have the perspective of
right.
a person who knew how to do it.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
but there's something interesting there, Mary, that I think that everyone's missing, right? Because there are people who are naturals at things, right? And there are people who don't need to be given propositions to do things. And then you see that a lot in the world and you don't really realize it. So everybody's got, unique skills or whatever, things they pick up on really easily. But there are some people who just are good at everything, right? Especially when they're young, right? And they just seem to get it. And so some people are given 0 propositions about scuba diving, watch somebody do it, right, on TV or whatever, and then they go out on a boat and they seem to be able to pick up all the patterns automatically, which is what you're doing when you're imitating. When you're imitating, you aren't looking at their propositions, breaking things down into procedures and doing it that way. I'm not saying you can't express things that way. Of course you can. That's what language is. But that's not what you're doing when you imitate. That's the parabolic. You're taking these patterns and
Right.
you're acting them out, right, as a participation. And then it's the fact that you're acting out the pattern correctly. That's the parabolic, right? That tells you, okay, there's other feedback mechanisms further up the stack, like you can miss a step, right? You can miss a pattern. And if you don't get into that pattern, things don't happen correctly. You can express those as procedures and propositions, but I don't think they are. I think that's how we talk about them because language, right? I don't think we have a way
Right.
around it. But that's the thing, is that you can learn things without using the other side of your brain at all in that scenario. And that happens all the time. And
Right.
that's how babies learn.
That's how the animals learn.
That's how animals learn. Exactly. And so, but you can also imagine a world where you're over boosted with propositional and procedural for whatever reason. Let's just say that people tell you a crazy story about why this person's successful, right? So you could believe, for example, that the reason why Warren Buffett is so ridiculously successful is because he picks good stocks. And then if you look into the history of Warren Buffett, that's not entirely true. He made almost all his money by buying Geico, right? And then because it's a monthly income thing, because it's an insurance company, that's where he made the bulk of his money, right? And so it's not really about him picking Home Depot versus whatever and restructuring the company. Not saying he's not doing that. I'm not saying he's not the most brilliant person in the world at it, but I don't care, right? Because in some sense, the way that he himself says he made the most of his money was from buying an insurance company, which is a monthly dividend thing and has nothing to do with picking stocks. And there may be some management components to it, but if you believe the story, you're like, oh, I can follow the Warren Buffett procedure or template or whatever it is, and with these propositions, and just plug in the propositions and I'll be successful. And you see that at the bookstore. You go to the bookstore, you can see hundreds of books on how to be successful in business, in relationships, in whatever. And they all have these propositions and these procedures. And there's a handful of bestsellers. There's a bunch of stuff that helps. But most of the books that are most helpful talk about patterns, like the 5 love languages. That's all about patterns, right? It's not about the process of creating better love or something in your relationship. That's not what it's about. And yeah, I'm familiar with the book, for example, but I haven't read it. So that's because I have too many books. So, but it's important to know that, right? Like you can't just dive in with propositions and procedures and be successful in the world. But if you were told you could, you might spend all your time there instead of understanding the underlying patterns. And then if you talk to successful people, like say you know a bunch of people who are successful at real estate, you say, tell me your story. How'd you get successful in real estate? Yet no 2 of them has the same path. No 2 of them. But you know what they do have? They all have similar patterns. And
Right.
if you can pick up on the patterns and then you can relate them to the ever-changing world, you are now an adaptable creature. And it's the adaptability that's afforded by the patterns because the stuff on the other side of the brain is static, right? Propositions are static, right? Procedures are more or less static. You can change them around and you can move them, but they're static things in some sense, whereas participation, every time I get into a conversation with Manuel, it's a different thing, even though we're doing the same, propositionally, we're doing the same thing, right? We actually follow some procedures when we talk sometimes in certain types of discussions, but every single time the participation is different and new parabolic interactions happen, right? And we've been having, like, we have a lot of, it's an internet thing on Discord, right? So, random people come in and sometimes they, maybe don't understand, but they fall into certain groups and there's patterns that we're discovering and trying to take advantage of to bring them in, right? It's all about bringing people in and enabling them to interact with us in a way that's positive to them. So one of the things I'm pretty passionate about now that John sort of got me hooked on, it's sort of my drug of choice now, is his meditation series, right? Which has turned into his ecologies of practices series. He's just giving us all these ecologies that we can adopt or not, right? Based on what we want, feel most at home with and need. And, so my big thing is to try to get people to do more of those things, because I think John's right about all of that. Like, this is what we need. We need more of this. And then that involves looking at their patterns. And we talk about this all the time. When people come into the Discord server, what are they looking for? How do we find out what they're looking for? How do we interest them in what we have? Because we want more people to participate, for example. So that's all participatory stuff. And we're trying to work through those parabolic fragments or pattern pieces or whatever they are to get them more involved. And then there's a bunch of other mappings that we can do. But ultimately, you can imagine a world where if you were too psyched up, if the signal on one side of your brain was too high, then it's possible that you might lose that sense of participation and not seek it. Right?
Okay.
And then what happens when that happens is you also lose that sense of pattern. And so when you have no patterns, you fall into chaos. Looks a little bit like today. And then also, if you don't know how to participate correctly, because you don't have the patterns that help you navigate participation, you can imagine that you don't have access to religion anymore. Because those are the things in religion. It's all symbolic and metaphorical and participatory. The whole thing. It's not about propositions. It's not about, if you do these 4 things, you're going to heaven. And if you do any of these 3 things, you're going to hell. That's, that's the straw man argument for why religion sucks or something. But that's not what religion is. Like, that's just like a ridiculous assertion, right? In some sense.
Okay, so I kind of intuit that you would agree with this, that our entire society is way too propositional procedural, that there's a much more natural way of learning and of moving through the world and of connecting with the world that we're disconnected from, and that probably has a lot to do with the whole meaning crisis thing, right?
Yes.
Okay, so here's one of the things that And this is why I love this deep continuity stuff, because I think that nature teaches us, but not through propositions. No, we could turn what nature teaches us into propositions once we know it, but that there's just things that, so like, like I know all the things in my yard very, very well. And I'm talking about when I see a tiny thing come out of the ground, I know like it's a weed, probably going to be a weed, but I know what weed it is, and I know how it's going to grow, and I know what its pattern of growth is, and I know when it's going to get ready to go to seed, when it's going to be the easiest to pull, whether it, what the structure of its seeds is going to be, whether it's something that I can, cut off and use as mulch, or whether it's something I need to get out of the yard because it's invasive. I know all the green things, I know which weeds the chickens like to eat. I know when they're coming up. I know, all the different herbs. I know all of these things. I know, and I didn't learn them by I just learned them by being there.
Right. You didn't learn them by reading a book or like going through.
I learned it by walking
taking a
around
class
and looking for years at the landscape, and knowing. And so, and my husband, who doesn't spend as much time as that, sometimes he'll point to something, he'll say, is that a vegetable, or is that a weed, or, what is that thing coming up over there, or whatever, but he's exactly that way with stuff, with like, if he looks at a machine, he knows it. And he even is so brilliant mechanically that he can't understand why other people can't see what he can see. But because when he looks at a machine that is running, that is operating, he sees inside of it. He sees all the gears turning. He sees the flow of the oil through it. Everything. He sees inside. He's like X-ray vision on any mechanical operating thing, but and he'll say shh, and then he listens, and by the listening he can tell what's going on inside of the thing,
right.
And so these kinds of knowing people have. My husband didn't get that by reading books either.
Right. Right. It's patterns. Yeah, it's definitely patterns.
So what we do, this is the thing, because John has talked with other people about education and stuff, but we want to stick the kids in a chair and say, here, look at this book, all the live long day, and here's your knowledge,
Right.
And then they're like, they don't know how to do anything,
Right.
Right.
Well, then they can't use it and apply it elsewhere. That's the interesting thing. And my friend talked about that years ago, right? He met a guy who was the son of somebody not famous, but reasonably well known, because he owns a car dealership in New England. So he has signs everywhere. And the guy was brilliant at one particular type of architectural work in computers, and literally all those skills apply everywhere in computers, and he didn't understand anything else. And I don't that scares me. I was like, what? How is that even possible? But yeah, there's that whole idea of, your inability to be flexible about what you know and apply it elsewhere. That's something that's involved in the parabolic and the perspectival, I think, or we're calling it the perspectival capacity that people have, which has flexibility and fluidity.
Right, that would be like making an analogy, right? So you could conceive as patterns, right? Like, okay, you have this pattern here, right, in the story, and you have this pattern here in the textbook. But if you don't know that the textbook can be the same as the story in a way, you'll never make the connection between the pattern, right? And then when you don't have the horizontal flexibility, I guess, between those two things, you can become like an expert, right? You can get into your field, right? You can get really deep, but all that knowledge is useless, right? Like whenever you take a step to the left or the right, there's no application of all of the patterns that you've learned, because you have no way to recognize the similarity, or maybe it's not even recognized, but trust it, right? Like you don't conceive it as a true relationship.
Well, one of the conversations I had with John, we talked about AI, and we talked about this idea that the scientists are going to produce these machines that we're all going to have to be subservient to, And I talked about it with him in the sense of saying, this is a little undemocratic, I think, because we didn't sign up to be servants to the machines, right? And apparently we don't get a vote on that because the scientists have already decided on it for us. Thank you very much. But I think here's one thing that I'm thinking. I'm thinking that the machines cannot do parabolic knowing.
Right. Yeah, probably at different levels. So at one level they can probably do basic pattern recognition but that's easy. But it doesn't help you apply those basic patterns to places that it doesn't know, although they're getting closer on that. But there's so many problems with how they approach AI, in my opinion, that they're never gonna. We're not in much danger. Believe me, they're going down weird paths with that, because they're taking the pattern that works and they're replicating it and thinking linearly about the problem. Like, well, if we just keep adding more, then it'll be able to see more of the world. And it's like, no, you need different ways of seeing the world. So, one way to understand why AI is on the wrong path is to say, if there's 4 types of knowing, how does the AI doing each type of knowing? And the answer is no, they only have 1. Some of them have 2. Maybe Watson or something has 3 types of knowing, right? Or ways of relating to the world or something, which is roughly knowing, maybe. So, but yeah, they're so down that rabbit hole of, no, we just need more. It's like, no, you need different. Right? And then you need a way to cohere the differences together and put them together. That would be the parabolic, right? It's those patterns that take things and allow them to be tested together and then allow decision points, but giving you a clear path. So like you get into the tunnel and then that whole section through the tunnel you don't have to worry about. When you come out of the tunnel, you get a choice. You can get off the highway this way, you get off the highway that way, you can keep going, right? Like that's a parabolic structure to some sense. Right. So the way it collapses combinatorial explosion is by giving you a time frame or an object frame, where you don't have to worry about certain things because they're going to play out. So, for example, you don't have to worry about whether or not your mother loves you because that's always going to be true, right? So, right, and then the only time it's not true, at some sense, is when you can't hear it anymore, right? But it's still true, right? But when she passes away, yeah, maybe she doesn't love you anymore actively, but you still feel that love, going forward, right? But you don't have to worry about that connection. That connection is there, and it's something that you can understand other things by. Like we talk about this, like when you look in the animal world, right? We have the whole mama bear thing, right? A while back, and right, you have all this tiger mom, right?
Right.
Right, all these patterns. It's like, well, that's weird, and it's like, look, why would a human relationship be like an animal relationship or look like an animal? Or why would you be able to draw that parallel? Like, what is that? Right? Why do parables about animals work in human contexts? Like, what is that? Well, that's the parabolic, right? That's the parabolic.
Right.
And I think the thing about the AI, like my bad idea where I'm dealing with is like, if you turn the parabolic upon itself, right? So if you do pattern recognition on the patterns, then that would be wisdom in my perspective, right? And when you get a sense of, okay, so if patterns happen this way, and then you can do the meta stuff, which everybody likes nowadays, we all go meta, then you can start making relationships in your life that are so wide that they basically encompass the whole of being. Um, and that's, I'm going to connect that to the idea of a worldview where you have a structure which is is so adaptive, right? Like it's so applicable that you can use it for every situation, right? Like in a sense, you're universally adaptive, and that's what like inherently human, right? Like we can adapt to each situation, and yes, so that would be kind of my argument against AI, and then the worldview thing, right? That is a thing I think a lot of people are missing, right? And that would result in like an existential angst where you're because you're not adaptive to enough situations, right? You're always anxious for what's coming at you, right? So you're in a permanent state of fear, and I think religion has always been a resolution to that, right? Because if you have the universal frame of God, right, and then everything follows out of God, right? So you can always, like, God is present in each situation, right? So you can always reference back to God, and I think VanderKlay makes this argument that God is the solution to the I
The
forgot what
frame of
problem it is.
frames. I think he says the frame of frames.
Yeah, right,
Right.
exactly. Right. So yeah, that's resolving also the combinatorially explosive way of being in the world, right? If you have the frame of frames, you can always reference back and say, oh yeah, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And a lot of
Right.
people don't have that ability anymore. So that we
Right.
need to give people ways of connecting back to that way of being.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I
then
think that's one of the things that I think I really like that John is bringing forth, is that we are talking about a way of being. We're not just talking about a set of propositions. But here's the thing, is like, that's true. That's supposed to be true of Christianity too. So Christianity is supposed to be a way of being, right? And what Paul VanderKlay talks about this, it's turned into a set of propositions. It's become so propositional that we've lost touch with the way of being. And whatever our way of being in the world is going to be, we have to get, I think, reconnected to the natural order. And we have to stop disconnecting people by insisting that the propositional and the procedural is like all that matters.
right. Yes.
Which is what we tend to do with them. And I just think contact with the natural world is really just super important. I mean, just having the time to sit in nature, to observe animals, to observe plants, this kind of thing is really, I mean, that's why I don't do John's meditation, because I can go outside and watch my chickens. So
Right.
that's why that can be my meditation, and I'll sit and watch my chickens, and I'll say, is there any relevance realization going on out here in this chicken coop?
So one issue that we've identified is that I think a lot of people have lost the ability to do that, or at least lost the ability to swap into that perspective easily, right? So you can put people in front of chickens, and they'll run back into the house to get their smartphone, to get impulses into their brains, right? So what we need to do, or what I think we need to do, is we need to afford those people an easy way back into relating in a specific way. And I think that will be done through making games where they start experiencing the world in a different way, but not so much that, oh, you go sit in front of the chicken pen. No, it's like that they'll naturally go there and want to participate in a way where they start experiencing those things that people have been experiencing forever, right?
What kind of games?
Well, the games would be based on our model of the ways of knowing, right? We would like identify, okay, so this is a big group of people who kind of need to relate more to the world in a participatory way, and if we can get some symbolic connections going, right, and if we can get the understanding of what it is like to make symbolic connections, right? Like maybe they pick that up and can apply it in other places in their lives, right? And then when you put these things together, then you can start generating a game in which those things are afforded to
Is
people.
this like a video game?
Well, whatever is easiest to make, and like we're hoping to pump out like lots of them if that's possible, but we got to start small, obviously.
And any kind of game, right? Are they card games like Magic the Gathering style? Are they cell phone games you can play on your cell phone? Are they tabletop games? Who cares, right? We want them all to the extent that we're able to build them. And we're hoping that our model allows us to do that and connect things a little bit more easily, so that we make those connections. But I find it interesting, Mary, that you've got this same, you recognize the same thing that that we've been recognizing, right? Which is this overboost on these two signals, right? This overemphasis on propositional and procedural. And it's built into our education system. And what do? They take recess away. It's like, no, more recess, fewer lessons, more recesses, right? And that, because that's participation, and that's what we need more of, how to participate in the world and do things that allow them to be encountering the patterns that help them to relate to the world. And then you can imagine, as Manuel was saying about the higher frame of God, for example, or the ineffable, you can keep going back there. Well, that's great, but how do you get back there? Well, there's a whole bunch of stories, right? Parables, right? And narratives around situations where you can make a connection back to God or the ineffable, and what that affords you. Like, why would you want to, right? And also what your options are when you do that. So maybe you can't connect to nature because nature's all over the place, and nature is chaos, to Peterson's point, right? And then nature's sort of like, it moves all the time. And so it's very hard to nail down nature with propositions and procedures. So, if you live in a city, it's not, because we've just taken all the nature out, right? So it's,
Right.
we know what to expect, right? But you kind of need that navigational skill in this continuously changing world, right? And so, how do you get that, right? Those are the skills that you need. Well, that's more what a religion gives you. What rituals help you to understand is the relationships between things. That's parabolic in our conception. That's what it is, right? That's how you make those connections. Then you can apply those connections across multiple frames or perspectives, or however you want to conceive of them. And that's what gives you a sense of trust in those things, so that you can do more with them, right? Because you can see that this pattern repeats, and it's not the same because kind of the actors are different, or the propositions are different, or the procedures are slightly different, but really the pattern is still invariant. It doesn't change at all. And that is more what we think we need more of. And that's the sort of stuff we're trying to get in the games. How do we get people involved with changing their perspectives? How do we get people involved with understanding that there are perspectives that aren't theirs, but are close enough that you can talk about things together, right? How do we get people involved with understanding symbols and how to interact with symbols, right? This is more what Jonathan Pageau is doing, right? Which I find utterly fascinating. I mean,
Right.
it's so amazing. And that's probably where we need our help the most, right? Because like when Jonathan Pageau goes through one of his symbol videos, I'm like, oh yeah, of course, all that makes sense. And then, I can't do that. It all makes sense in hindsight to me, right? But I can't break things down that way. I don't have whatever magic it takes to do that. But part of that is your ability to express the parabolic, to connect the parabolic back to the propositional and to the wider frames, right? Because a lot of what he does is he talks about the different frames in which things happen, right? Then he says, but don't let it loop forever, right?
Right. Right. Okay. Well, I think this is good. I think this is a good conversation. So I understand a lot better where you guys are coming from. I see that I'm not probably going to win you over on the prepositional.
Still thinking about it. It's new.
Yeah. So you might think about that whole business about how much you're relating it to navigation, right? And
Ethics as well,
I
right?
really like taking it through the chain of being. And once we get to a certain level, all you've got is movement in one direction or another, movement to something, away from something, up on something or off of something or whatever. So I think it might connect, but I'm gonna probably have to make an argument about that with John. Anyway, but I think this is good. I really understand. I'm glad that you guys liked it, and that it's useful. So I guess I'll just wish you the best on your project that you're putting together. So this is like a paper that you're working on, right?
Yeah, I wrote up a draft, and of course, I didn't even go to college. Like, what do I know? I read a lot of white papers and stuff, but like, I don't know how to do this. I've been blessed. Everybody in my family knows how to write. Thank goodness. Uh, uh, but yeah, we need to rewrite it. Manuel's got a bunch of additions that need to go in there now, and then yeah, the paper framing is wrong, and so
Yeah,
we're
and
fixing that.
we have this other issue that we come up with ideas faster than we adding stuff to the paper.
Yeah, we could write 4 more papers just off the stuff we have in our notes, because we have
Yeah,
lots of notes and lots of connected ideas. Like, this is, the ways of knowing are really central, but we've actually gone way past that to some extent using the model already that we have, and we're connecting things together to sort of understand more some of the larger issues. And yeah, those would be interesting to talk about too at some point, but we could go on for hours. It takes me 2 hours to explain my model of 4 types of knowing plus perspectival at the bottom to new people who aren't familiar with John's material. And then when I talk to people who are familiar with John's material, it takes 4 hours because they don't like it. And we're constantly coming to, well, what's wrong with it? Like, what, here's what I see is wrong, that doesn't work from our perspective in John's model. What do you see that's not working from your perspective in our model, right? And so, yeah, it's kind of funny that people more familiar with the vocabulary are like having a harder time.
Well, now when you say you have a lot of ideas and you have a lot of notes, so have you have you done research in some of the people that John references, or different people in the field? Are you bringing in?
well, we're kind of cheating, right? We're looking at videos and we're looking at descriptions and we're like, okay, what are they really trying to say, right? So we're doing the pattern recognition, and then we're like, okay, so if we're putting that on the societal scale, and then like, what are the dynamics that come out? So that is our process more so than diving into literature, because in a sense, I don't think that's helpful, right? Like, everybody's doing that anyway.
So
Right.
we'll have to put a disclaimer on the front of this video to tell college students, do not watch this video.
Well,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
come to the Discord and get
Right.
evangelized.
A lot of discussions, right? And it's really helpful. A lot of people are like, I feel like I'm asking stupid questions, right? And like, oh, Mark, you've watched all 50 hours of John's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and you've done 102 meditation sessions with him, and he has some of these concepts in there, right? Like his new ecology is savoring, where you go outside and you savor, and it's very useful to be reminded to do that. But I'm trying to describe this thing to them, and they're like, I feel bad because I'm asking stupid questions, and I'm like, no, I'm getting so much out of this because now I have to figure out how to tell you what about it, right? And so that just helps me understand it all the better. And from those discussions come these little one-line notes, and then they turn into whole sections in our little notepad, right? Like just the other day, I realized we don't have a section on perspectival capacity. We've been talking about it for months, and we haven't actually written out what it is and all the things we think are there. It's like, that was a stupid thing to do, right? So we've corrected that. We now have a section for that. And then, yeah, there's all kinds of new concepts. We've got this historical grounding concept, and we've got the realm of transformative coupling. We've got all these, I'll throw these little teasers out, right? Things we could talk about that would take just as long, if not longer, just to talk about with types of knowing and why we think this is involved in the meaning crisis, et cetera. But ultimately, like, without John's language, none of this could have happened. Like
Right.
0% of this. Before he came along, and I mean, I'm a big Peterson fan. I watched almost every public thing Peterson did for until recently, right? Until there wasn't
Right.
any more. But he's a pragmatist, and I'm a pragmatist. I like that. But he didn't put together a vocabulary. He didn't put together a science of meaning, which is what I classify John's work as, a science of meaning, to allow us all to communicate in a way that we can be generative. And it's the generative communication that I want to emphasize. That's the generative communication from John's work is key to all of this. Like, we would be the nothing scrubs we were before, struggling, going like, I know there's something here, but I don't know how to talk about it. And even if I did, I can't talk about it with anybody else because we just didn't have the vocabulary. And so really, this is all because of John's great work and all the time and effort and all the wonderful, like the lectures are wonderful. His Q&As are wonderful. He answers questions so wonderfully. And otherwise, we couldn't do any of this. Right?
Yeah, and then the self-selection of the people who are interested in his
Right.
thing, right? Like there's a lot of wonderful minds hanging around on that Discord.
And his availability too, right? He's still available. Like I talked, we did it today, right? You were there, right?
He really
Yeah.
is. He's wonderful.
He answered another question for me that really helped me understand where his model's being informed from, right? And what we need to do to adjust ours to make sure we're informing the same sorts of things. But we couldn't have done it without all of that. Like, there's no way we could have gotten together. And the Discord's such a wonderful place because people come in and they ask questions, and sometimes they get involved, and that's wonderful, right? The more people we have, the more involvement we can get, and the more people we can help. There's some people that come in that are in pretty bad shape, and we try to talk them through things they might do and stuff they might engage with, and people have said that's been helpful for them. And this is all because of John's work, ultimately.
Right. Yeah, you guys are definitely coming at it from a different perspective because you're more engaged in it in the practical standpoint of trying to help people to discover. I haven't had a meaning crisis, but I understand, John's description of it and listening to people talk about it. I understand why it exists and all that. But you're more involved in the hands-on, really assisting people, and I think that's
yeah,
just.
I'm a casualty of the meaning crisis.
You're a
like,
casualty. I think Portland and Seattle and Chicago or Milwaukee or whatever, or Minneapolis are all casualties of the meaning crisis.
Right.
Yeah, let's get them to play games instead, and maybe they'll end up doing dialogos with us.
I don't know. See, See, my idea would be, let's get them all to plant gardens and keep animals and feed animals and then feed people. And if people would be fed better, that it would solve a lot of our problems, because I think a lot of the mental problems that people have has to do with them eating badly. So
yeah, there's a lot of evidence for that. Yeah, that's definitely true. Yeah, unknown gluten allergies and all sorts of weird things, right? Yeah.
So I think we should wrap it up because I'm getting tired anyway. But I think we should wrap it up. But you know what? At the end of the Discord conversation with John, somebody started talking about divine feminine. Was that one of you guys or somebody else?
No, that was Tyler. But I love to talk about the divine feminine. I think Michelle has told you that probably, but yeah.
So, yeah, we need help with that, Mary. So at some point, we would love to have you tell us.
We should get together and do something on that. But I have some videos on my channel about masculinity and femininity. I've got more work. I need to do more work on that. But yeah, I think that'd be a great topic for conversation. I would love to get into that with you guys, and maybe we could do that next time we talk together.
Yeah, I just want to say you had this awesome argument. Was it against Vervaeke or VanderKlay? No, it was against VanderKlay. Yeah, about what was it? The Catholic way of having relations and all that stuff, right? That just
you
blew
mean
our
what
minds.
I was talking about? I wasn't really arguing with him, but it was talking about. That was when we were talking about masculine sexual energy is being
yes, yeah, that was awesome.
Our civilization And see, I'm an unusual woman in that I really just like men a lot.
Why, thank you.
Actually, I'm just a normal woman. So anyway, that was the conversation that I had with him. So maybe you guys like that conversation, and we could bounce off of some of those ideas.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
that was a great conversation. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I'm gonna wish you all a good night. And I'm gonna stop the recording. Okay.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you so much.